Microsoft had more money, better engineers, and a superior product, and still got demolished by a company that was already dying. In 2006, Steve Ballmer stood on stage and announced Zune, not as an apology, as a threat. Microsoft was going to kill the iPod. They had the resources, they had the talent, they had something Apple didn't, a decade of Windows dominance and the ability to force their ecosystem onto millions of computers. So why, by 2012, was Zune a punchline? Why did a company worth hundreds of billions lose to a device that was already becoming obsolete? Well, the answer isn't what you think it is. Let's start with the obvious. Why would Microsoft even bother? Apple's iPod owned the market. By 2005, it had 75% of the digital music player space. But here's what people forget: the iPod was a hardware play in a world about to go digital. The profit margins on the device itself were shrinking. iTunes was the real gold mine. Microsoft saw that. They also saw something else, a vulnerability. What if you could make a player that didn't require iTunes? What if you could tie it directly into Windows Media Player, which was already on 400 million computers? The idea wasn't stupid. It was almost reasonable. Microsoft's problem wasn't the concept. It was execution and arrogance. The first Zune launched in November 2006 with a brown leather aesthetic that looked like someone's rejected briefcase. The hardware was fine, the software was fine, but fine doesn't beat elegance. Apple had turned the iPod into a cultural object. Microsoft turned Zune into a gadget. Why does that matter? Because culture beats specs. Every time. The Zune had features the iPod didn't. It had a bigger screen. It had video playback. It had a wireless sharing function called Zune Pass that let you share songs with friends. On paper, Zune was the better device, but nobody cared. Why? Because nobody wanted to be the person carrying the brown Microsoft player. The iPod was cool. Zune was what your dad would use if he was forced to. But there's a deeper problem. Microsoft didn't understand what they were competing against. They thought they were fighting Apple's hardware. They weren't. They were fighting an ecosystem, an experience, a religion almost. People didn't buy iPods because they were objectively superior music players. They bought them because they fit into a lifestyle that Apple had carefully constructed. Zune tried to compete on features. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was timing. And here's where I don't believe in coincidences. In 2007, the same year Zune was trying to gain traction, Steve Jobs walked on stage and showed the world the iPhone. The entire conversation changed overnight. Suddenly, dedicated music players weren't the future. Phones were. And the iPhone, because it had iTunes baked into it, made every music player, including the Zune, look like yesterday's technology. Microsoft didn't see it coming. Or maybe they did and they didn't care. Here's what's interesting. Microsoft kept throwing money at Zune. They spent over $1 billion on the platform across 6 years. They updated the hardware. They improved the software. They tried to make it cool. They even signed exclusive deals with bands. But you can't buy culture. You can't engineer cool, and you definitely can't force people to care about your product just because you're the biggest software company in the world. By 2009, Zune had maybe 3% of the market. By 2010, the iPhone owned everything. By 2012, Microsoft pulled the plug. They didn't announce it with fanfare. They just stopped. The Zune marketplace shut down. The devices became useless bricks. Millions of people who'd bought into the ecosystem were left holding expensive paperweights. Microsoft moved on. They always do. But what did they actually learn? The real story isn't about Zune failing. It's about Microsoft's blindness to what actually matters in consumer tech. They thought market share meant power. They thought engineering excellence meant victory. They thought their distribution network, Windows, was an unbeatable advantage. It wasn't. Because by the time Zune died, the entire playing field had shifted. PCs were becoming secondary. Mobile was becoming primary. And Microsoft, despite all their money and engineers, was playing yesterday's game. So what's the answer to the original question? How did Microsoft, with every advantage, lose to a company that was already being disrupted? Because they fundamentally misunderstood the business they were in. They thought they were selling hardware. They were actually selling identity. And you can't manufacture that with code and cash. Subscribe, because the next billion-dollar failure is already being built. And you'll see it coming before the board does.